Hello and welcome to Developing Opinions. If you're worried about this being a political video, don't worry. I'm not here to tell you which side to take. Rather, I want to examine a proposal, how one side is structured to guarantee support, and how efforts to oppose fail. In short, the issue is miscommunication. Someone shared this proposal about government employees and NDAs, expressing concern how it strips protections for whistleblowers. Out of curiosity, I read the document and had some observations about how it was crafted to lock down opposition. Before I start reading, I think it is important to acknowledge that if you are on one side, you might immediately see this as an attempt to undermine the rights of the press, media under the First Amendment. Whether that is true or not, that is the wrong way to approach this. While that may get you some allies, this document is framed to address a fundamentally different question. Failure to recognize this is what leads to miscommunication and not understanding each other. Now for the document. The first thing I noticed is media is not explicitly mentioned as a core issue. Instead, the summary is framed about safeguarding confidential information and following due process for disclosures. So already in the summary, there is phrasing meant to disarm that whistleblower concern. See, so it said here, while expressly preserving the right to make disclosures authorized by law. Okay. In the first paragraphs, it gives background into its authority on this matter and explains how the differing rules about disclosures can create issues. It also provides its stance about whether government employees are allowed to disclose information. It does affirm certain cases. However, in its main argument is that improper disclosure leads to disruption of what it calls legitimate federal activity. Or not calls, but it's basically framed as that. So at this core, the document's key problem is leaks interfering with legitimate federal activity. To back this up, the document then details several cases where leaks disrupted activity or put members of the government or law enforcing members in danger. Again, the focus is not whether you consider these leaks justified or not. The point here is about undermining legitimate federal operations, including constitutional activities. It uses the Supreme Court as an example of instituting NDAs following leaks. The attempted murder of a Supreme Court justice here is a big one. This piece is loaded, which means you have to be most careful here. If you say the attempted murder is justified, then you lost the battle. If you acknowledge it was unjustified, then you give ammo to the other side. I'll go into how I approach this later. The rest of the document appears to claim that the NDA is not adding new restrictions, but rather standardizing. So let's look at the NDA. This one's dated May 26, 2026. And at first glance, it looks like a normal NDA. My interest is in the exclusions. Here it states that whistleblowing protections are in place and communications to Congress and reporting to the Inspector General are permitted. Perhaps the biggest concern for me is executive orders, as we know those can be flaky. There is an appendix here, but that requires extra legwork to read. Similarly, the talk of government-wide policy also leaves room for obscurity. So taking into account both of these documents, I think we can see how it's formulated to guarantee support. It takes an issue and frames it as interfering with what it is framing as legitimate operations and risking lives of figures in the government. It does not specifically mention anything about the media or the press, and instead frames disclosure as needing to follow the law as already established. A problem oppositions would have is they often do not address these, but rather work backwards, focus more on the approach, areas of abuse, and consequences. However, supporters would be focused on the problems stated by the document, not speculation. So even if the hidden agenda is true, it's not necessarily the correct avenue for converting people, especially when the proposal does a good job of trying to disarm that. Why? Because it's approaching from your own values rather than trying to understand the other sides. How can you convince someone of something when you don't establish you value something similar? Acknowledge their concerns, show that you share them or correct their understanding, and then you can make progress. Now, is it reasonable to think this is an attack on the press? Well, it could be. I don't know enough to make a call, but who else would employees be leaking to? And if you consider the news recently, it's not outside of the realm of possibility. However, that's still not the right question. Remember, the problem is not about disclosures. It even says there are some areas where disclosures are permitted, but rather disclosures that impede or threaten what the government considers legitimate operations, with the Supreme Court being the biggest case. Another way of thinking is this is not about whether the press has the right to leaked information, but whether it should. That is the core question that would fuel debate, and that would be a big one with valid arguments from both sides. Okay, now about that Supreme Court case. I still don't know much about this, but again, you have to at least agree attempted murder is wrong or you will lose. What's key here, though, is that this proposal frames the leaked draft as the cause. Yeah, right here. Motivated by the release of the leaked draft decision. So, it's not actually the decision, it's this framing that the leak itself is the motivation. Like, if the leak didn't come, then this assassination would not have happened. That is an interesting thing, and probably the weakest link of the whole document. This means the murder threats and attempt would have to have occurred before the decision was published, and as an attempt to disrupt the judicial process. I don't know the details, but if that's true, then you would need to contend with the question of leaks being acceptable or not. That again is something to cause debate. But if you approach it correctly, then perhaps the correct response will come naturally. If you have ideas, feel free to leave them in the comments, as long as you are respectful. On a related note, something to be careful about is not attack neutral parties. Neutral parties are people who have not yet made a decision, and this means two things. One, they are the closest party for you to convert. And two, they are in the most objective position, meaning they help you prepare for how to discuss with the other side. In other words, the neutral party is the third party point of view. They are the bridge between two sides. To attack a neutral party would be like if the defense in a court attacks the judge and jury. It's not going to be favorable for the defense in that situation. And similar to a courtroom, they are key. That's it for now. Thank you, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.